Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to the Neo-Fusionist Book Review. This is not your typical book review, as I make no claims to political or philosophical impartiality. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore the premise of Neo-Fusionism. Neo-Fusionism is the merging of paleoconservatism with naturalism within the framework of the revitalization of the Republican Party. We will be exploring politics, philosophy, psychology, economics, and sociology through a wide variety of books published both recently and historically. Thank you for tuning in. So this week, we're going to be looking at a book called Standing in the Light: My Life as a Pantheist. And that's by Sharman Apt Russell. So, after last episode, you might be thinking to yourself, does it really have to be like this? Are we really just living in a mechanistic world where everything down to our very behaviors and the things that come out of our mouths, point by point, strictly deterministic world, there's nothing left in it, and at the absolute best case scenario, some sort of pure randomness creeps in at the subatomic level, and that's what I've got? That's not going to give you free will. And if you wind up after that last episode thinking there's got to be more to it than this, what a cold, depressing vision of reality that is. Well, that's why I'm doing this book this time. Standing in the Light is an exploration of pantheism, which is sort of the religious side of naturalism. It's an exploration of, can there be more meaning in the world, even if it is still naturalistic? It's not a break from naturalism. It's not a retreat to a supernatural deity. But it's designed as a way of saying that what we know to exist is an adequate substitute for God, essentially, that is worthy of sacred, of being treated as sacred, and being valued or being even worshipped or appreciated in that sort of transcendent manner. So this should kind of maybe warm things up a little bit before we proceed into more of the meat of our discussion. I just didn't want to leave you guys hanging with that completely mechanical worldview and meaningless, hollow worldview it could be perceived as. So I'm going to jump right in here. Now that we've looked at a basic understanding of the definition of pantheism, it's essentially the idea that everything is God. That's pan, meaning everything. Theism, meaning God. Everything is God, essentially, is what pan. And then there's panentheism, which is more of the notion that there is a transcendent God that is both immanent in the world and external to the world as well. But we're concerning ourselves with pantheism. And so she talks a little bit about pantheism, and she says, quote, "Like any religion, pantheism disagrees with itself. There is confusion and contradiction. We can define pantheism as the belief that the universe is an interrelated whole that deserves human reverence. Everything is God, but the definition of everything varies. What Paul Harrison calls scientific pantheism imagines the universe to be made of one substance, matter/energy. The dance of matter/energy is beautiful and holy, but also impersonal and non-sentient. As Spinoza first outlined, human consciousness is a product of matter and dies when the body dies. For a few pantheists, including some Hindus and Buddhists, the reverse is true. The universe is also made of one substance, but that substance is mind, not matter. Matter is an illusion, a product of mind. Everything is God, and God is consciousness. Other pantheists, also known as dualists, separate the universe into two substances, matter and spirit. Since spirit can exist without matter, the human soul can exist outside the human body, beyond death. There may be a collective world soul that manifests itself in different forms, such as gods. A form of soul or spirit may be present in plants, animals, and rocks. This kind of pantheist might also be a polytheist or an animist. He or she might have a magical worldview, supposing, for example, that simply thinking about an object can affect that object, and that nothing is bound by merely physical laws. Non-flying things can sometimes fly, non-thinking things can sometimes think. I don't believe that. I am a scientific pantheist, credulous in my own way. The culture of science is a distinct one, and certainly mine. I believe that the latest discoveries in biology, chemistry, and physics are true, or at least true for the moment, for science is a method, not a destination. I believe that we live in the body of the world, and that we are compelled to know the world. We are compelled to witness. Thoreau set the bar. The woman who sits in the house and sees is a match for a stirring captain. Those still, piercing eyes, as faithfully exercised on their talent, will keep her even with Alexander or Shakespeare. I believe in that woman. I believe that what we see is real and important, and that we have a natural urge to see ever more clearly. I believe that I live inside larger laws. In the culture of science, the religious impulse can be explained by evolutionary biology. Religion either had some genetically inheritable advantage for the human species, or was a byproduct of something that did. This is fine with me. The fact that a sense of the numinous may be hardwired does not make the numinous less of a true feeling. Similarly, if I know anything as a parent, I know I would give my life for my child. The fact that maternal love is hardwired does not change that love. Moreover, I would not want to feel differently. I would not want not to love. I believe that science is about connection and complexity, harmony and surprise. Science is about beauty. The more I see, the more I know, the more beautiful the world seems. Importantly, the way I experience beauty has always been physical. The yellow sunflower hits me with a friendly punch. A mountain view causes a flutter in my chest, a subtle movement, something like an ache. We say that the heart soars, a common description for what we feel before a beautiful natural scene, or a painting, or a piece of music. There is a sense of hollowness, a hormonal cascade. There are sensations. Neurologically, however, I am not built for mysticism. My heart soars at the sight of beauty. Something in my chest flutters. But I never faint or have oral hallucinations. My spiritual responses are not dramatic. Because of this, I have to work hard for my religious view. I have to have faith. My sense of beauty is also limited, almost always evoked by the natural world. Once I did feel an enormous connection, the heightened pleasure of existence, standing in line at a pharmacy in Walmart. All that color, all those things, and the smiling, complicated faces of people. I recognize that humans are not outside nature, and that our accomplishments are often extraordinary, but for the most part I am moved to an understanding of the divine by the non-human, the beloved that is not me. In this, I am fairly conventional. End quote. So, in that first section there, she kind of adds a little bit to our rough definition of pantheism. She points out a couple of different versions of pantheism, and she identifies herself with the scientific pantheism, which I think is appropriate. That's like the naturalistic pantheism. I think anything deviating from that scientific pantheism that she describes is not really naturalism, which is what we're aiming for. So you could say that scientific pantheism is a type of naturalism. I think that would be appropriate. And I like what else she brings up toward the end of that quote when she talks about perceiving beauty as the other, as something other than human. Aside from her experience in Walmart, she generally finds that she experiences beauty from the natural world, and defines the natural world as those things that are not part of the human world. And I think that's common to most of us when we consider, like, we wouldn't consider ourselves out in nature if we're standing in line at Walmart. You know, that it's a wholly human constructed world of everything is processed by human design. I think when we think of nature, we think of those things that are not human, but then we're also going to concern ourselves with human nature. And so we could look at that as those parts of our existence that are not designed by us, that we are subject to. I think that would be a good way to separate human nature from human constructs. So, with that said, I'm going to move on. She talks about the ancient Greeks a little bit, and she also talks about Marcus Aurelius, and she talks a bit about the Stoics, and identifies them as early pantheists. And so I am interested in all of that, very much so. We'll be looking at, over the course of this podcast, we'll be looking at the ancient Greeks. I expect we'll be looking at Marcus Aurelius at some point, and Stoicism and some of those ideas, being that they are quasi-naturalist, or even completely naturalist, just maybe with a very limited understanding of nature. But the design of their epistemology, I suppose, is naturalistic. And so we're going to look at that. I find the ancient Greeks particularly interesting. And so I'm going to read a little bit about when she talks about some of the early Greeks. She says, quote, "Today, the early Greek most associated with pantheism is Heraclitus, who lived 30 miles north of Miletus and was young when Anaximenes was old. Heraclitus does not quite fit the definition of a physicus, since he made no contribution to any of the new fields of science, such as physics or astronomy. He was more interested in the inner world of the human mind than the outer world of natural phenomena, and his pithy sayings include, 'I went in search of myself,' and 'man's character is his fate.' Like the physici, however, he stressed the importance of the human senses and of reasoning. Whatever comes from sight, hearing, learning from experience, this I prefer." Heraclitus believed that the universe had underlying principles or laws, which he called the logos. These underlying principles could be expressed as a two-part idea. All things are one, and all things are in a constant state of change. The task of a human being was to seek wisdom through understanding the logos. As a teacher of the logos, Heraclitus was a riddler and a literary stylist. To get across the concept of oneness, which he might variously describe as fire, God, the logos, or Zeus, he wrote, "God is day, night, winter, summer, war, peace, satiety, hunger." To explain his idea that everything in nature was always in motion, he noted, "One cannot step twice in the same river." For Heraclitus, constant change meant constant conflict. Thus he proclaimed, "War is father of all and king of all." At the same time, he believed in an ultimate and sacred unity that reconciled all opposites and strife. The same thing exists in us living and dead and waking and sleeping and young and old, for these things having changed around are those, and those having changed around are these. The epigrams of Heraclitus require some pondering. But if you have ever read any philosophy at all, you will only feel grateful to this man for the brevity of his language. In his own lifetime, and for centuries afterward, his enigmatic style was rarely well received. In addition, he provoked the anger of the Greeks by mocking traditional views and icons, saying, for example, that the beloved poet Homer should be beaten with a staff. For this arrogance, his biographers would punish him with a humiliating death in a dung heap. Many threads begin with Heraclitus and return to him. His work would strongly influence the later Stoics, who took the notion of logos and made it their own. In turn, the ideas of Baruch Spinoza can seem strikingly stoical. Much of the wisdom of Heraclitus resembles philosophical Taoism, a form of pantheism that arose in China during the 5th to 3rd centuries BCE. Similarly, the concept of a unity that encompasses all opposites and change is echoed in modern physics, in which the universe is a process of change based on the underlying oneness of the quantum field. I find these echoes both exciting and disturbing. On one hand, part of me persists in thinking that the modern world began just a short while ago, and that ideas are formed in a linear fashion. Yet the familiarity of men like Heraclitus and Anaximander hints at something outside history and linear progression. Perhaps ideas are more intuitive. Perhaps they are real and leap at us like tigers. End quote. So that's a cool section there where she talks about Heraclitus, who is pretty cool in how he introduces the idea of the logos. I'm really interested in this idea of logos, and I think I am much more inclined to kind of seek out Heraclitus's use of the term than, say, others that see it differently. Like Jordan Peterson uses it. I don't see as though he uses it quite the same way that I would prefer to use it. Heraclitus sees it as a binding force of the universe. It says Heraclitus believed that the universe had underlying principles or laws, which he called logos. That's pretty straightforward. An underlying binding principle of law of the universe is the laws of physics and the laws of cause and effect. The relation of structure to function. These are the fundamental laws of reality. And so they are all the logos. The meticulously granular interconnectedness of everything. All right. So now we saw a bit about that, Heraclitus's vision of the logos. She moves into evolution a little bit, which is super important. So let's see what she has to say about this. She says, quote, "We have the same brain as our Paleolithic ancestors. Some scientists believe that the religious impulse is in the architecture of our brain, a byproduct of evolution. 1. We believe in God because we are evolutionarily adapted to believe in what psychologists call an agent, something independent, purposeful, and outside ourselves that could affect us, possibly in a bad way. Humans who assume that it is a lion causing that ripple in the grass, rather than the wind, tend to survive longer. 2. We believe in God because we are evolutionarily adapted to create narratives and explanations. The tracks in the sand mean that a deer recently passed this way. A pool nearby means the deer might be thirsty. And if it moves here and I move there, I could be eating its leg for dinner. Life isn't just a matter of chance. Life is about cause and effect. 3. We believe in God because we are evolutionarily adapted as social animals to understand that other people have minds. We cannot see what these invisible minds are thinking or planning, but we would be wise to anticipate whether they are friendly or angry. We believe that there are invisible forces in the world, invisible minds in solid bodies. Why not then a mind outside the body? Why not an invisible agent involved in the story of our own life? Although such an idea mostly describes theism, the message is the same for pantheists. We are predisposed to believe in a meaningful, interconnected world, as well as in something outside and larger than ourselves. We may choose to believe in these things because such beliefs motivate us to cohere socially and are generally more fun and interesting than not. Other scientists say that religion is less a byproduct of evolution than an actual adaptation furthering longer life and more reproduction. For example, religious belief may have allowed our ancestors to marshal the placebo effect offered by shamanistic healing. Although scientists are not sure how the human body responds to the idea of a cure and heals itself, we know this happens on a regular basis. Ritual healing may have been particularly important when there were fewer medical options. People who inclined toward a belief in shamans, spirits, and gods, who had more of the hardwiring that promotes religious experience, better survived injury and diseases, and thus had a reproductive advantage. From then to now, the hardwiring hasn't changed. We are, of course, running new software. We read, we write, we fly through the air, strapped into plastic seats, drinking Diet Coke. I will never see the world the way a hunter-gatherer saw it. In terms of my relationship with the earth, I'm sorry about that. I feel left out. I feel incompetent. But there you go. That's history, Thomas Berry would say, and by this he means that the universe is an irreversible, emergent process. We are unfolding. We are moving forward, along with everything else, changing and being changed. We carry with us our past and our genetic coding. We are who we are, but we can't go back either. End quote. So that's a cool section when she talks about the origin of religion and provides 3 evolutionary explanations for how people have come about to have religions. And she also talks about the importance of that to us evolutionarily and culturally. And so I think that kind of leads in with the idea that some of that function can be served by pantheism without stepping out of the scientific worldview. So the 3 evolutionary processes or explanations for religion are, number 1, the intuitive perception of agency in the world around us. And number 2, the intuitive inclination that we have toward understanding the events around us in a narrative capacity. And number 3, our intuitive awareness of consciousness, intellectual consciousness resembling our own, that resides in other things out there in the world, other people. We can, see some degree of consciousness in animals. And so that we might be evolutionarily adapted to recognizing that external intelligence, which is kind of similar to the number 1 with the recognition of agency. But also she talks about the cultural explanation that essentially religion is a cultural construct that serves purposes. That serves a purpose for us. It may not be something that's hardwired, but that basically provides us with benefits. And so, therefore, we do it. Which are 2 important ways of looking at religion and whether or not we need it. But I think that if we're inclined toward it, and we've always been inclined toward it, and have seen benefits from it, and we can conceive of benefits we may have seen from it, and the fact that we have it means that it was a successful strategy. Otherwise, we wouldn't have it. Nature's stingy like that. Doesn't give us more than we need. We acquire it because it works. So that may be why we have it. And maybe it's smart to continue to have it in some form or another. So, from that point, she begins to talk about morality a little bit. And I'm just going to read a short little part here where she says, quote, "We live with the ghost of the brilliant 19th century scholar and prophet George Perkins Marsh, like some righteous Scrooge, poking his finger at the out-of-season fruit on the table, at the microwave, at the roll of paper towels. The ravages committed by man," he intones, "subvert the relations and destroy the balance which nature has established, and she avenges herself upon the intruder by letting loose her destructive energies." In 1999, at the close of the last century, Thomas Berry wrote a book called The Great Work, Our Way into the Future. Berry pointed to different cultures that in their time accomplished something significant. The Greeks began the Western humanist tradition. India had the spiritual insights of Hinduism and Buddhism. The Native Americans populated a continent with ritual and song. Today, Berry believes modern society also has a great work, which is to shift our industrial civilization into a relationship that protects and lives in harmony with Gaia, the earth we live on. Berry is clear. It won't be easy. He is honest. We aren't doing this by choice. We do not, after all, choose the moment of our birth, our parents, or our culture. We do not, he wrote, choose the status of spiritual insight, or political or economic conditions that will be the context of our lives. We are, as it were, thrown into existence with a challenge and a role that is beyond any personal choice. The nobility of our lives, however, depends upon the manner in which we come to understand and fulfill our assigned task. End quote. That's a nice part there. She talks about the great purpose, the great work that this man, Thomas Berry, talks about in his book. So she's quoting from this other person, Thomas Berry, but it's a great, I might have to get that book and do a review of it. It's a great section there. And I think that Thomas Berry is right in that we're thrown into this moment. And I think that naturalism and pantheism and the innate respect, profound respect that they encourage, and that pantheism in particular encourages for the natural world, and the natural world as we perceive it, most notably as those things other than us, that we need to have a recognition of beauty and a reverence for those things which aren't us, and thus not just rampage over everything. And that reorientation of our civilization is the calling of this moment. And I think there's something to it. I like that. So that's cool as well. Kind of gets into the naturalistic morality. And then there's one last part that I want to read because she used to be a Quaker. And then she kind of stopped being involved so much after a number of things happened. She gives a number of reasons as to why she stopped being involved, but she mentions one most particularly. She talks particularly about her trip to Guatemala, and she says, quote, Polly and I went to Guatemala in 1998, a few years after the peace accords in which the guerrillas and the Guatemalan government agreed to end their 35-year-old civil war. Polly had not yet joined the meeting then, and she went to Guatemala to see Mayan ruins and be a tourist. I also wanted to see Mayan ruins, as well as talk to Quakers working with the poor. I wanted to see how Guatemalans had survived during those terrible years only a decade ago. I wanted to understand more about violence and social justice. Before the trip, as is sometimes the case, I read too much. I read about Hector Gomez Calido, a leader in an organization of grieving mothers and wives, relatives of the disappeared. In March 1985, Hector Gomez was burned by a blowtorch and his tongue cut out. At his funeral, Rosario de Cuevas took the microphone to promise that his death would not be in vain. 3 days later, Rosario was found dead, raped, and mutilated in a ditch, along with her brother and 2-year-old son. At the second funeral, mourners stared at the hands of the baby. His fingernails were missing. I read about the massacres of the 1980s, the men and women set on fire, leaping into the air. I read about the School of Americas and the manual on torture produced by the American military. I read about the capucha, the hood made of rubber that is tightened around a victim's neck until he suffocates. I read about the Mayans 1,000 years ago and how they tortured their captives too. More fingernails pulled out, more skin sliced slowly with knives. Later, when the Spanish conquered the Mayans, they also took prisoners, Mayan lords, whom they also mutilated and burned alive. I read and filled up with fear. In the month that Polly and I visited Guatemala, a Mayan leader and his son were dragged from their home and shot. 2 community leaders were stabbed. A Mayan woman lobbying for land rights was killed. 2 more activists were tortured and killed. 5 men were found executed. 5 more bound and shot at close range. 2 more dumped in a football field. Dozens of people working for human rights received death threats. Terror and heroism were still part of Guatemala, as they had been part of Guatemala for so long, for as long as people wanted something more, something better. At the Mayan ruins in Tikal, surrounded by temples from the classic period, Polly and I talked to our hotel owner, whose father had been executed by a military death squad, and to a guest of the hotel whose brother and sister-in-law had been killed by guerrillas. In Antigua, we visited a Quaker woman setting up a Montessori daycare. For $75, she told us we could send a child to public school for a year. In Guatemala City, with a Catholic nun as our guide, I dragged Polly through a garbage dump, where diesel fumes and rotting food mixed with the odor of human waste. A man squatted in a corner defecating. He saw us and glared. A truck brought in a new load of garbage as men and women stood and waited to go through it. More angry young men sat on the tires that seemed to be everywhere. The nun led us into a shack where we met a mother whose 4th child, a girl with polio, was going to college to learn accounting. This woman had gotten up before dawn to wash her clothes for a fee at a public laundry 2 miles away. She had no water or electricity or toilet, but she had a child in college. She seemed to tremble with hope. In Guatemala, I learned how much I was willing to help, and it wasn't much. A little money, not much. I learned that I could turn away from children in need. In that turning away, I did not feel separate from anyone, not even those men who torture 2-year-olds. For a while, I thought I had come to Guatemala to die. Not because I was endangered, but because I felt so much death all around me. How I loved my life when I thought I was going to die in Guatemala. How I missed everything I had so foolishly left behind. In Guatemala, I saw that my children, my husband, my home were all I had. Sleepless in the hotel room, staring up at the ceiling, I swore to myself that I would go back and live my intimate life with integrity and awareness. I would be as luminous as the flame in a candle, but I would also be as small and as extinguishable. I would not be living in the light. This fear had nothing to do with the light. In Guatemala, I learned about selfishness. This self was all I had. My connections were fragile and finite. Without them, I was unanchored. I had no place. I could do nothing for the rest of the world, which was unanchored like me, crashing about. I could not stop the burning of people or the anguish of those young men sitting on tires and waiting for garbage. I could only hunker down. It was not simply that I was not good enough. I did not want to be that good. In Guatemala, I wanted only to rush home, gather my family, and put us all on the bed, bring up the covers, and hold on to each other. Instead, I went back to Quaker meeting and became clerk. I served on the Ministry and Oversight Committee. I took my turn on the Nominating Committee and the Hospitality Committee. I went to a half-yearly and yearly meeting. I sat in internet chat rooms with the Committee on Unity with Nature, but nothing was ever quite the same. End quote. And that is the section on Guatemala, which I think is just amazing. That she just experienced a degree of poverty and violence and destruction that made her question what she valued most of all. And she recognized that she wasn't going to be able to fix Guatemala. And that she was risking her life by being there. And that what she realized was the most important thing was her family, her children, her home, the things that are familiar to her. And as she writes this book, she talks about what she's doing with her life. I mean, she's not just talking about pantheism. She's talking about all these things that she's doing, and her involvement with the Quakers, and her involvement with this nature conservancy group in the Gila River area, and the time that she spends bird banding and bird watching and being involved in conservation projects in the Gila River area. And she just has said, this is my home. This is where I am, where I belong, where I act. And this is where I can have an impact on my direct surroundings. And as long as she's doing her duty to the people and the place that are around her, the people and places that are around her, then she is building something that is anchored and stable in the world. And that just because other parts of the world are unstable doesn't mean that she should also destabilize her own family. She therefore goes back and further stabilizes her family and her home and her environment and her culture, her little platoon, if you will. And so I think that's pretty cool. Not that there's anything wrong with helping the people in Guatemala, but she understands that the greatest benefit occurs at home. Charity begins at home, and maybe charity stays at home and is most beneficial in the world when it is closer to home. I don't know, just a theory. We'll be exploring that theory and the ideas of morality and naturalism and conservatism as we proceed through this podcast. I think that I've covered the basic things that I wanted to cover in that book. So I'm going to wrap this up at this point in time. You can check out my social media presence. I'm mainly on Facebook. I also am active on Twitter to a lesser degree, but Facebook is my kind of thing. And I'm on Patreon as well. So if you're digging the show, you can, of course, go there and help me out. I suppose that's all for now, and I hope you tune in next time around. See you later.